Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me this afternoon. My name is Matthew Bowles, the Director of Professional Services at Pink Elephant, and I'm very pleased to spend the next 45 minutes to an hour with you talking about delivering value while leveraging supplier integration, which is more and more a topic of great interest in the industry. I think in terms of just being able to ensure that we are maximizing the value that we get out of the supplier relationship and trying to ensure that we're successfully engaging throughout the terms of that relationship is a very critical piece to the puzzle from an IT delivery standpoint. So I'll spend the next 45 minutes to an hour with you. You have the opportunity to put questions in the chat. I'll try to address questions towards the end of the session, and certainly my contact information is available at the end of the presentation. And I encourage you, if you have any specific questions, to reach out to me directly. In terms of agenda, we'll talk about a little bit about why supplier management is so critical. We'll cover some typical issues that are being experienced with the supplier management process. We'll talk a little bit about supplier management as a process from the perspective of ITIL. And we'll also talk about how to be successful with this supplier management engagement. Both proceeding when we're starting to look at suppliers throughout the negotiations and finally through fulfillment, trying to ensure that we're maximizing the value. And as I said, we'll look at any questions that come up specifically during the course of the webinar. Towards the end. And again, I encourage you, if you do have questions, you can reach out to me directly following the event today. Thanks again for joining us today, regardless of the time that you're listening, whether you're on live with us right now, or when if you're listening to this as a recording later. So when we look at service management and the role of the service provider, so if we look at the role of IT as enabling business value and business outcomes, so that the business can be successful, generating profit, treating patients, educating students, regardless of the core focus of your organization and your business, we want to ensure that as an IT provider, we're enabling that success, right? That we're identifying the appropriate resources and capabilities to assure our business of what they need, when they need it, and how they need it to successfully create customer value in a repeatable, consistent way. And that drives our business to be successful. So as a valuable partner in the provisioning of IT services, we need to ensure that the resources and capabilities that we've defined are going to be sufficient to meet the demands of our business. And sometimes what we experience as an IT provider is that we don't have the core competencies, or we don't have the capabilities that are necessary to deliver a particular service independently. And that's where supplier management becomes so critical to us, is that we want to ensure that we're identifying a supplier that's going to enable us or augment our existing capabilities or potentially our resources to enable that successful delivery of service. But we have to be cautious that we're not giving up our ownership or accountability to the business on the delivery of that service when we engage with a supplier. The business, keep in mind, doesn't recognize a difference or a distinction into who within IT is provisioning that service. So when we're creating the design of a new service or we're making changes to a service, we're incorporating a supplier in the delivery chain, we need to make sure that it's a seamless integration between the user or customer experience and how we're managing that overall engagement. More and more today, we're looking at suppliers as a key contributor to the overall value that IT is delivering to the business. And what's critical is that we as IT providers want to maintain the control of that supplier relationship, right? We want to ensure that we have an understanding of what the requirements are, how it's expected to be delivered, how it ties into our own internal processes and capabilities to ensure that it's a very seamless delivery of the overall service that we've agreed to provide to our customer. So we really need to make sure that we have a very clear understanding of supplier management within our organizations and how we are, as IT, very key contributors to that process, even if, as is the case in many organizations, IT doesn't own the procurement or supplier management relationships, right? We don't own or control that piece of the business. Quite often, procurement is outside of IT, but we are absolutely a very key stakeholder, and we need to make sure that we're very proactive in engaging and managing the activities related to supplier management from an IT context. So some typical issues with the supplier management or working with vendors that we quite often hear or experience within our organization is that there's a lot of focus on what the return on investment is. So if we can outsource this component of IT, or we can leverage a supplier to deliver this software as a service, rather than building up the skills and capability internally to maintain the development cycle of that application or host it internally, we're often driven by cost as opposed to value that's going to be achieved in the overall relationship. So price is always going to be a critical element when we're looking at suppliers, and we absolutely need to take it into context or consideration in helping us to make decisions around what we're trying to achieve with this new relationship, but it shouldn't be the driving force behind decisions that we make. Ultimately, we want to ensure that the suppliers that we're utilizing are contributing to the overall value that we're trying to create for our customers, for our business, to ensure the successful outcomes of their business processes. As I mentioned, IT is often excluded from supplier management, right? Where we don't own that process within the business. Functionally, procurement is often outside of IT, and we need to ensure, in terms of trying to mitigate this, that we always have a seat at the table. So when there's a business request that's coming through to source some element of IT component, that it's actually being fulfilled appropriately through our IT processes in terms of request fulfillment or coming through as a service portfolio request for a new service, so that it's not going directly to procurement or going directly to the supplier management team within your organization for them to start sourcing potential suppliers without the agreement or contribution of IT as a part of that process. We really need to make sure that the requirements are clearly understood, right? That we clearly understand what we're trying to achieve as a portion of the service that's being delivered by that supplier. Whether they're delivering a complete service or they're just augmenting a service within IT as a supplier or a partner in the delivery of an overall end-to-end service, we need to make sure that we clearly understand the requirements. What are the service levels that we need to we need to have in place in order for this to be successful. So without understanding how the supplier manages changes or how they manage incidents or manage problems, we really need to understand how that aligns with our own internal practices to make sure that we can define that working arrangement between the two different organizations. This is much more complex in terms of dealing with an external supplier than it is working with another silo within your own organization. So it really needs to be very clear how we define the requirements that are going to enable us to be successful in a longer-term relationship. We need to make sure that overall expectations of what we're trying to achieve are clearly understood internally, right, within our own organization, working with our business partners as well as within IT. But certainly we need to make sure that the supplier understands the context of what we're looking for and what the overall expectations are that we're trying to establish with this supplier agreement. We want to make sure that we're not overbalancing one way or another the overall agreement. So there's often, as a part of terms and conditions or service levels, if the supplier doesn't meet certain thresholds or certain levels of service, we're going to penalize them in terms of what the financial contribution might be. So a risk versus reward type of scenario within the service levels. Ultimately, we want the partnership to be seen as a win-win scenario for both the IT provider as well as the supplier that's coming in and providing services to fulfill the needs of the business. We don't want to have one part of the equation see this as a loss to them. So we need to make sure that as a part of the agreement, as a part of the overall terms and conditions, that we really are entering this as a partnership. We're really looking to be successful, and that there's a clear path on how each party can be successful in an outcome through this negotiation process. Where we get structure from our procurement group around request for information or request for proposal, we want to ensure that that's very clearly defined internally, and we want to make sure that we're tailoring the RFP or the RFI for the type of engagement or the type of delivery that we're looking for. So it can't be a situation where one size fits all. We want to try and make sure that each RFI that we submit, each RFP that we submit to a select group of suppliers is really trying to encourage a response to a specific need that we have at that time, so that they can have clearly defined evaluation criteria, and we can go through in a very successful manner to really vet each of the suppliers and choose a successful supplier that we really believe is going to meet the requirements of our immediate need, but also take into account that although we're going to a supplier to address a specific need at this point in time, that ideally there's opportunity to grow throughout the terms of the actual agreement. And we want to make sure that any supplier that we choose is going to participate in the growth and the changes and allow for that moderation without having to renegotiate the terms or conditions of the contract every time there's a shift in terms of need for the service. We want to make sure that that's all incorporated in the way that we're doing business. Once we have the agreement signed and we're starting to see the service or the supply of the service delivered, we need to make sure that we're having regular touch points with the supplier. So the same way that we would look at business relationship management between IT and our business stakeholders, we really need to make sure that there's a supplier business relationship management component that's working with IT to ensure that the services being delivered are meeting the requirements, that we're on track to achieving the service levels that have been achieved, and that we're continuously looking at opportunities to improve or streamline areas. And it shouldn't be a one-way discussion where IT is communicating with the supplier on things that are not working for them. The supplier really needs to have a voice on talking about where certain processes or certain activities are not working for them, right? They need to be able to articulate or describe scenarios or situations that are impeding their ability to be successful. And we need to be attentive to those conversations and try to be understanding and empathetic so that we can really build a very strong, successful relationship. So let's talk a little bit about the supplier management process. Supplier management is a very critical part of service design. So if we look at service strategy, feeding in from a service portfolios perspective, the type of service that we're going to be offering, and looking to service design to actually build out our capabilities and resources so that we can realize that service. Service design is really where we're making decisions around how are we going to approach this new service? How are we going to do it? And are we going to define the resources and capabilities internally? Or are we going to make a step to say that, you know, this really is outside of our core competence, but we think that we can leverage a supplier to support this component of the service, or take over the entire set of activities that are required for a complete end-to-end service. My view is that we should never outsource or use a supplier to take over a problem area of our business that we don't understand. I have a firm belief that we really need to make sure that in using a supplier, we really want to leverage them for areas where we understand what it looks like, right? We understand what a successful delivery of that service looks like. We can articulate it. We've proven that we can do it, and it makes sense for us based on our direction or the changes that are going on within our internal structure, that we look to a supplier to take that over for us. So that we can shift and reallocate resources to other internal areas that are more strategic or more advantageous for us to focus on. So when we're leveraging a supplier, we really need to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what the capabilities are and what the expected outcome is before we turn on the switch, right? Before we actually enable them to start delivering this new service or this component of a service. So we need to make sure that we're finding out what the gaps are, how can we achieve those, and how can a supplier help us to build that out through the definition of requirements, through the sourcing aspect of the supplier management process. And we really need to consider whether looking at the delivery model is it just a single supplier, or are we using multiple suppliers to enable this successful delivery, right? So these are all considerations that we need to be looking at as a part of the design of this overall service. So the key activities, or the main purpose of supplier management as a process within the ITIL framework is, number one, we're trying to ensure that we're obtaining value for the money that we're spending on the supplier engagement. We're not just looking at trying to achieve direct results. We really want to look at this in terms of what is the value that this supplier is contributing to our service, And do we feel, right, is the perception with our business and the perception within IT that we're obtaining the value for money that we're spending? If there's concern with the level of quality or the level of attentiveness that the supplier is providing, or they're not being seen as a key contributor to the overall service, then that's really where the review and the remediation process needs to be kicked in so that we can address that successfully and try to move things forward into a corrective path. But ultimately, the supplier management focus is to ensure that we're going to really ensure that value is being delivered. We want to make sure that the service that's being delivered is seamless, that there's really no gaps between what the business is experiencing and how IT is seen as fulfilling those requirements. That there's not a gap in performance. And here's a great example that I've experienced in my past. Working with a global organization who had outsourced a significant component of their IT, and as a part of the overall service levels, their agreement with this client or this supplier was to have clearly defined response and resolution targets for priority 1, priority 2, priority 3 incidents. The clock was triggered once the incident was assigned to the supplier. So it wasn't triggered at the time that the incident was reported to the IT service desk. The supplier actually, their clock started at the time that it was assigned to them. So in this particular instance, what occurred was there was a priority 1 incident. It was registered with the service desk of this organization. They worked on it to try and they responded to the incident within the appropriate timeframes. They assigned it to an internal IT support group. They tried to resolve it. It was determined that it needed to go to the third party for them to be involved in the resolution. By the time that transition occurred, there was no way that the resolution was going to be achieved within the time frame of the overall service level agreement between the business and IT. Because as soon as it was passed over to the IT supplier, the clock reset. So it took 2 hours to get it to the supplier. Now it's back to 0. The supplier now has 4 hours to do their resolution, but by the time they restored the service and got it back up, we'd already exceeded the threshold of our service level for a priority 1 incident with our business. So it's very critical that we understand how it fits together from end to end in terms of looking at the overall life cycle of an incident and how does it feed into our overall service level agreements with our business, and do we need to renegotiate? Do we need to change the terms of those based on what we're going to be able to obtain from the supplier? But at the end of the day, we need to ensure that the integration of services that we're providing with our supplier are seamless to the business, that there's no negligible impact to the business as a result of leveraging a supply chain. And at the very end here, we want to ensure that the overall contracts that are being maintained by supplier management, that those commitments are being fulfilled, that we're achieving the service levels, that we're achieving we're sticking with the terms and conditions that are a part or a key component of that contract. So key objectives, again, value for money from suppliers and contracts, right? We want to ensure that we're really receiving value, and value is really the critical part there to ensure, and just like our business is trying to make sure that they're receiving value from the services that we deliver as an IT provider working with a supplier, we want to ensure that that's supported as well. The alignment of service level agreements service level requirements is a very critical component, right? Just going back to my last example in terms of ensuring that service level agreements that IT has negotiated or put in place with the business in terms of how do we manage changes, how do we manage incidents, we need to ensure that the fulfillment of those changes and incidents when we're using a supplier does not negatively impact our ability to achieve those service level agreements. And what that means is that we may have to renegotiate the service level agreements as a part of this new service offering that we're leveraging the suppliers for, or we have to ensure that from a contractual perspective that the supplier is going to fit into the existing service levels that we have in place and be a part of that overall fulfillment capability in the end-to-end of an incident lifecycle, for example. Supplier management plays a key role in managing the overall relationship. So they're certainly facilitating that those monthly or quarterly meetings that you're having with your suppliers, ensuring that what is it that you've achieved, what are the continual improvement activities that the supplier is putting in place. If there's deficiencies in the service that's being provided, what's the corrective action that they're taking to eliminate those deficiencies or those gaps? Supplier management also plays a key role in bringing together the appropriate or correct stakeholders that need to be involved in the overall evaluation and negotiation activities when entering into an agreement. So we want to make sure that the right people are at the table for the evaluation and subsequent decision making around the supplier selection. ITIL references a supplier contract management information system, and if you have such a tool in place, basically a repository where you may keep a list of preferred suppliers or vendors that have already been vetted that you would go to. That should be maintained here. Actual contracts, agreements that are in place, performance, outcomes of review meetings. All of this should be maintained within the context of this management information system, and that's so that we have ready access to information about the suppliers that we're working with, or suppliers that we can consider working with because they've already been pre-approved by our supplier management process or team. So key activities here within the supplier management process. So if we look at this from a high-level set of activities that would typically be performed by supplier management. First, the supplier management strategy and policy. So when and how should we be engaging with a supplier? So have we defined any parameters around or policies around the types of services or the types of resources and capabilities that we would look to a supplier to provide or provision for us? So this needs to be looked at so that we're operating within sort of the agreed parameters of our environment, of our organization. Supplier management is going to be responsible for the definition of new supplier or contract requirements. So again, working as a part of service design as we start to define those service level requirements, as we start to realize that we don't have the internal resources and capabilities to fulfill this full service or this component of service, we need to make sure that we're clearly articulating the requirements so that an appropriate request for information or request for proposal can start to be developed, right? So that we can start to put that together and we can start to use that as criteria in helping to identify either with suppliers that have already been vetted, that are already a part of our database, or new suppliers that we have to go out and research to be included in the distribution of that request for information or request for proposal. So we want to ensure that that's clearly defined. We understand the type of contract requirements that are necessary so that we can put together an appropriate evaluation set of practices and processes and identify the correct stakeholders that need to be involved throughout that process. Supplier management plays a leading role in the evaluation of new suppliers and contracts. So again, they would fulfill the main negotiator, if you will, in the review of proposals, making sure that key criteria has been met, but then also bringing together the appropriate stakeholders that need to be in the room or at the table to conduct a thorough evaluation of the supplier and the contract that they're proposing to utilize. Once we've done the evaluation, actually getting through the negotiation and the establishment of the overall agreement that's being put in place, again, supplier management has the ownership of that activity to be thorough in ensuring that the service levels that we need are being met and fulfilled, that there's a clear way of the supplier to provide management reports or reporting on the service levels, and that it's an agreed method between both parties. But we want to ensure that all of the terms and conditions are put in place and that we've got a successful framework for this new partnership that's being established. The management of supplier and contract performance. Again, supplier management is going to play a key role here in terms of that interface, capturing the information, distributing that to stakeholders within IT to ensure that the performance is meeting expectations. And where there's expectations that are not being met, that there are corrective actions that are being taken between the supplier management group and the supplier themselves, right? So what are the steps that you're going to take to ensure the fulfillment of your obligation based on the agreement? We want to make sure that that's being proactively managed and proactively delivered with very clear milestones in terms of how the supplier is going to take corrective action internally to achieve the results that were expected in terms of the overall supplier agreement. Supplier management involved obviously in the contract renewal or termination process. So ideally, we're looking at renewals every sequence of time. They need to be mindful of changes to the scope, changes of strategy for the delivery of the service that a particular supplier might be enabling. And so they need to be kept informed of any significant changes that would either force a non-renewal of an agreement that exists, or that we do want to continue the service provision, but there's going to be different terms and conditions that we need to consider. And you know, as a last stage, in the event that we're really not getting the value that we expected out of this supplier, that they're managing the termination of that agreement and making sure that that's done cleanly between the organization and supplier, based on terms and conditions that were agreed for those activities. So supplier management has very key interfaces with a number of other ITIL processes. Probably the most prevalent would be with service level management and trying to ensure that we really understand what the overall links are to the component or full service that we're getting from the supplier, and how does that tie to the overall big picture view of what IT is providing back to the business, so that we're in sync in terms of how we're managing our various processes, how we're managing our service levels end to end, with the inclusion of services that are being provisioned by the supplier. So it's a very critical activity that service level managers are actively engaged with supplier management to understand from a performance perspective, but also from the viewpoint of evaluation, that the agreements that are being negotiated or are being signed off will enable IT to meet their obligations in terms of service levels, in terms of operational level agreements, to be successful, to ultimately be successful and deliver an appropriate service back to our business. IT service continuity management, we really want to ensure that from a supplier perspective, that they have the necessary understanding of how critical this component of the service is to our sustainability, right? In terms of how are we going to ensure that this component is ongoing and continuous, even in the event of a crisis, that they have the ability to restore either within our timelines so that we can fulfill service continuity back to our business. So we really want to make sure that as a part of the agreements that we're establishing, as a part of the needs assessment, that we understand what their response and recovery solutions are going to be to provide IT service continuity back to the overall service. Service portfolio management, from the perspective of identifying new services or significant changes to services that are coming into our portfolio, and our ability to determine where we need to leverage suppliers to help us fulfill those services. Financial management, understanding how suppliers are going to impact any sort of cost models or accounting that we have. How does it feed into our overall budget for IT? And how are we going to leverage that to ensure that we're operating within our means? Overall financial management best practices. We need to understand from an information security perspective how is the supplier protecting the confidentiality of information that they are exposed to or that they're seeing in their systems. The availability, certainly, in terms of, are they living up to the availability needs of the services that they're providing, and is the integrity of the information being maintained successfully as well? So information security is good questions to bring to the table during the evaluation, during the selection process, to understand what their practices are, how does it interfere or interact with your existing information security policies, and where is the alignment that's going to ensure that there's a proper or appropriate fit between the supplier organization and your own. In terms of change management, we look at change management in terms of how do we change the actual scope of the agreement, right? So when we first started, there was an agreed scope that consisted of X and Y, but over time we realized that we actually need Z as well. So how does that actually fit in terms of the change management process for the actual contract and the service that's being delivered? But then there's also, from an operational standpoint, as they're going through the maintenance activities, just normal maintenance activities against the service, what does their change management process look like? And how are you involved in that process? Is IT still playing a role in change advisory board from the supplier point of view? Is it a shared service that you're consuming as a part of the delivery of the service, or is it something that's unique to your organization that's being delivered? And how does that change or impact the way that changes are managed and the level of authority that you might have in the acceptance of timing around that change? So ensuring that you have a clear understanding of how changes are being managed, how changes are being delivered, is a very critical piece of the overall understanding with the integration between the supplier and your IT business. So let's talk about a few areas that you really need to be looking at to successfully engage with suppliers and ensure that they're being set up to be successful on your behalf as well. So if you look organizationally, we need to make sure that if supplier management within your environment really is being managed outside of IT, that there's a recognition that IT needs to be a key or critical stakeholder in the definition of requirements, in the understanding of who's being proposed as the different suppliers to meet those requirements, and a part of the overall evaluation process. So we want to make sure that the business is engaging with IT as a part of a successful supplier management process, rather than bypassing IT altogether and trying to define requirements outside of IT's influence or control. So we want to ensure that that the reverse is true as well, and that if IT is looking to source a supplier for the provision of services within IT, or to add additional capabilities or resources, that IT is leveraging that organizational supplier management process or your procurement practice effectively as well. So it's a two-way street. If we have expectations that we're going to be involved from a business perspective, we also need to make sure that we're involving the business in decisions that we make around the leveraging of suppliers to support us in the delivery of services that we've already committed to. We need to make sure that we're not forgetting stakeholders in terms of legal and compliance. So depending on the organization and the compliance needs that we have, privacy needs that we need to uphold to, any standards that have been established for our industry, we really need to make sure that as a part of the supplier management and the engagement activities, that we're taking these needs and requirements into consideration. And we have a very clear understanding of what level of wiggle room there is that exists, so that we can be mindful of those issues. Ideally, as a part of best practice, we're trying to make sure that we're capturing experiences from one supplier engagement to another, and we're sharing that experience, so that we're building a repository of knowledge or best practices, very similar to what we would do as a post-implementation review. We really should look at conducting an evaluation at the end of a supplier engagement activity, and really try to understand what went well, what didn't work out so well, and what should we be capturing in terms of improvements the next time we go through this type of engagement in the future. And that's something that supplier management should take ownership of and socialize with the key stakeholders, so that there's a mindset of that improvement opportunity. So we want to look at policies as well, in terms of policies that we've established, and how do those drive requirements or needs in the establishment of a supplier agreement. So by sharing key policies with a potential supplier, they get a better understanding of our operating guidelines or our operating principles, and what's important to us in terms of the delivery of services to our business stakeholders. So it's very important that we take this into consideration, and that we try to ensure that the supplier has a clear understanding of operating guidelines or principles that we have in our organization, and that they have the opportunity to ensure that they can align effectively with those key policies. So helping to ensure that these policies are relevant, they're practical, they're going to contribute to the delivery of value, and they're not just something that we're creating for the sense of having some sort of policy to do something that's really not contributing to the overall value that's being delivered on this service. They need to be published, and they need to be known and available not only within the IT organization, but also within the supplier organization. So people that are involved in the delivery of this service really need to understand what these guiding principles or policies look like, and what they're expected, how that's expected to drive their behavior in the fulfillment of the service itself. So stakeholder engagement is probably the most critical component of this, especially during the selection and evaluation portion of supplier management. And we really want to make sure that as we look at the overall scope of service that's being provisioned by the supplier, that we look at it from all angles, and we really clearly understand both from a functional or a direct interaction with that supplier or with that service, and an indirect view of that service, that we've got the right stakeholders involved at the right level through the negotiations, through the selection criteria. So typically identifying a core group of people that are going to be involved throughout the evaluation process, with an expectation that there may be extended team members that might be brought in for very specific components of the evaluation, or as a second voice to see what the supplier is proposing in terms of being able to fulfill and deliver. And what does that look like, and how would that impact the current operating model that's been established within the organization? We also, making sure that we've got the right legal representatives or the right compliance representatives is also key here to ensure that our policies are being addressed successfully. But again, if we engage the right stakeholders up front and they're part of the decision-making process, that should really help with the transition of moving that service or building that service leveraging the supplier. So it's helping to lay the groundwork of a successful supplier engagement, and it's helping to drive the correct expectations between IT and the supplier. Right? It's trying to, here's what we're expecting, here's how we expect you to be operating, here's the service levels that we can agree to that we believe are necessary to be successful. And it's laying the groundwork or laying that foundation to ensure that the supplier is on the same page. And the supplier needs to be bringing in the right stakeholders as well. By the time we get to the agreement phase, it's not the account management team that we want to be dealing with directly. Now we want to make sure that we have the delivery team members, the leader of that group, who's going to take the lead, who's going to take the role of the business relationship manager. These roles need to be clearly defined as a part of the evaluation, and we need to make sure that we're starting to build up a good rapport through those discussions around negotiating before we sign off. So making sure that we have appropriate requirements really needs to happen before we even go out to the supplier, right? This is something that IT needs to be able to work with the business very closely to understand what those requirements, and ultimately the requirements are what's going to to drive the decision to actually go to a supplier in the first place. And the realization that we need to go to a supplier comes as a result of the service needing something that we don't have the competency or the capability to deliver as effectively as somebody in the external to our organization, as a supplier that's maybe an expert in this field. So the requirements really need to be clearly defined. We need to be able to make decisions off those requirements to actually go to a bid process to look out here. And when we build out then more detailed requirements for the supplier engagement, we want to ensure that we're looking at not just how are they going to deliver the service, but how viable is their company? Have they been in business a long time? Are they a niche player? How many clients do they have? Often if an organization has hundreds and hundreds of clients, the level of attention that they can focus on you, focus towards you, and as one of many, is more limited. So are you looking at a supplier that's more of a niche player that has a smaller client base but has the ability to really focus attention in on you and ensure that there's a good partnership in place? So all of these sort of non-functional requirements, these are not directly related to the technology systems or services that you're buying, but really more around how are we establishing the relationship and how are we going to fit within the overall business model of the supplier are very key components to be looking at as a part of your requirements and evaluation process. So this is where we need to look at from a process evaluation standpoint, really looking at an evaluation and standing up to the supplier. So again, the delivery team within the supplier organization, and understanding how their operational processes align to your own operational processes. So how would we manage or facilitate a change that's initiated within our organization that requires the involvement of the supplier? How does the supplier initiate a change that they're managing within their environment, but impacts a system that's being utilized by our organization as a part of a service? We really need to understand from the ground up how these processes are tied together, how they're aligned, and try to make sure that we've got a way to make this work as a part of the delivery. So looking at it from a change perspective, from an incident management perspective, looking at it in terms of problem management, does the supplier have a problem management practice internally? How does that work? How is it implemented or managed? How is that going to be used in terms of improving services that they're delivering that are going to add or contribute to value that's being provided? So looking at how are they being proactive to manage problems within their environment. So the review process around selection, we really want to make sure that it's well understood, not only internally within your organization, but that you're sharing that information with the supplier as well. We want to make sure that they're putting their not just their best foot forward, but that they really understand what they're going to be looking at or what they're going to be required to do in terms of the review and the evaluation process that you're taking. So make sure that you're following rules, policies that you've established throughout for the selection process, that you've got clearly defined review criteria set up for the RFPs, that if there's product demonstrations that are necessary, that appropriate use cases are being provided to walk through those demonstrations. Again, the more that you can look at a product demo that aligns to your specific business need, the better that evaluation process is going to be kicked off. We often would request that the fulfillment of the use case, especially in a product demo, be done out of the box with no customization, so that we can see how closely aligned a particular product is to meeting the requirements of our use case, without having to make any sort of customization to the product. Ensure that we've got the right stakeholders involved. Ensure that the suppliers are providing the professional services group, or the group that's going to be responsible for the delivery of the service, as a part of that evaluation process as well. So again, ideally through the evaluation and the review process, we're actually starting to build a relationship with the delivery side of the supplier organization. And of course, we want to make sure that that appropriate references are being looked at, and taken into consideration. You know, we want to make sure that as a part of that, we not only have the opportunity to talk about the supplier with a potential reference, but even if there's an opportunity for a site visit or that type of more detailed analysis of how an organization has been able to be successful leveraging that supplier. Ultimately, we want to make sure that we're finding the right balance between cost and value, right? So we want to make sure that we're creating a scenario where IT and the business as a whole are achieving the results for the business services that they're trying to deliver. They see the value in the relationship with working with the supplier, but that the supplier also feels that they're gaining from the relationship as well. So it's not overly restrictive, that we found a win-win situation where it's mutually beneficial for both organizations, and both organizations recognize the overall benefits of this relationship. In terms of contract negotiations, you know, ultimately when it comes to terms and conditions, we want to leave that to the experts in the field. We want to make sure that the appropriate stakeholders are obviously involved, but ultimately there are certain things within our contracts that need to be sacrosanct. They can't be changed. And we need to be able to identify those areas within the contracts and make it clear what the overall risk is to our business in making modifications to those terms. We really should, before we go into the negotiation, understand what the limits are for us, where there's going to be potential restrictions on where we can't go beyond this particular point. Again, we're looking for this win-win situation. And the terms and conditions, the service levels that we're putting in place really need to be clear. We need to make sure that they're unambiguous, that they're well understood. There's no hidden secrets. On a service level perspective, we want to make sure that the supplier can demonstrate how they're going to measure against those service levels, and that there's agreement between the supplier and the organization on how those measurements are being put in place. The framework for our overall relationship and the tone of our relationship is often set in the review and the evaluation and ultimately the negotiation process. So we really want to make sure that we're both the supplier and the organization are putting best foot forward on trying to build a positive relationship with the longer term view that both parties are trying to be successful, right? That want this relationship to be successful in the long term. And at the end of it, once we've actually put the agreement in place, we want to ensure that we're successfully managing this relationship, that we have regular touch points, that we understand who the account management team is going to be and how we're going to manage that structure. And it can't just be the organization pushing back to the supplier that there's issues or concerns. The supplier also has to have a voice in these reviews, and they have to identify where there's gaps in us providing them information that's critical for them to be successful as well. So we want to make sure that there's a balanced perspective here, that the discussions and the review sessions are equal opportunities to establish improvement and try to really move this relationship forward into a successful long-term relationship for this customer. Ultimately, when there's issues, they need to be addressed as quickly as possible from either party. Because as soon as we start to leave those issues standing, we're really going to run into very significant issues in the overall relationship between the organization and the supplier. So that brings this webinar to a conclusion. We're already just at the hour mark, so I apologize. I'm going to wrap things up here. I do encourage you to send me an email if you have any questions. My email address is listed on the slide here, m.bowles@pinkelephant.com. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have around the topic that was discussed today. I really appreciate your attention and your joining the session today. I hope you found it valuable, and look forward to seeing you in a future event. Take care.